In this section, I'd like to talk about how to start a food forest. The first part really is observing, getting to know your site and assessing the environment that you're in. For example, considering the wind. Where does it come from and what season, how strong, getting to understand how you might need to be able to protect possibly your food forest, particularly the younger food forest, from strong and damaging winds. And so you can design and locate particular plants to protect your young and established food forest from strong winds. Another thing you really need to consider is the sun path in winter and in summer, and to think about how you can utilize that as much as possible to get light in at all levels of your food forest. And perhaps considering too, if it's a really strong sun, that you might want to encourage extra shade, or perhaps there's shady areas in your site and you need to think about keeping your food forest quite open. So really looking at light. How does light play a factor in your site? As similarly with water, where is the water coming from? Where does it flow to on your site? Where are the places that you could source it and collect it and direct it to your food forest area? And also thinking about slopes. Do you have a flat spot, or are you working with a slope? And what are the sorts of strategies that you might need to do to maximize the use of your slope? And I'll talk about that in just a minute. And of course, as we've mentioned in the previous sections about soil, really looking at what soil do you have and what are some of the strategies that you might use to improve that soil. So before you even begin planting anything, you've got to know what it is that you're working with, and spend the time doing that and enjoy the process of planning and designing and imagining and looking at other designs and exploring different sorts of plants that you might be able to incorporate into there. Really first though, identify the area it is that you're working with, which is the space that you're going to turn into a food forest. How big is it? Because in terms of scale, you need to start thinking about scales of plants and how many plants you might be able to feasibly fit into that space. So what is the area that you're looking for? Identify what your main pathways and flows are going to be through that site. How do you access it? One of the things I've seen quite often is that people plant out a massive great area but forget to actually think about how they're going to get in there and harvest things or maintain it. It's a really important part that you integrate the food forest as part of your main garden, and the flow of it encourages you into it, to use it, to maintain it, to harvest the products, and encourage your children to go in there too. So pathways and flow of movement through it is a really important thing. Now, before you begin any planting too, you've got to think about whether you need any earthworks done or any major soil improvement to be able to support the growth of the plants and to direct water in different ways. So perhaps you might even need to incorporate some trenching for some taps or some swale. So things that you might need to bring machinery in, do all that before you start doing any planting. And also consider if you need any protection for the plants. Now that could be from the weather, as we talked about with wind, high winds, or it could be from, sea spray if you're on the coast, or it could actually be from animals. Sometimes there's animals that come in and eat trees, and even the hardy pioneers, it might be deer or kangaroo, maybe it's bandicoots. I'm not sure what your local particular predator of trees is, but they do make an impact if you don't think of them. And just on a side from that, it's also really important if you are out in a broader zone to think about how wildlife moves through your site. I did a lot of planting in very early days down in my bush tucker food forest area, but what happened was that it was also a spot where the kangaroos kept going past, so my trees consistently got snapped over as they jumped past. So I quickly learnt to watch where not only I like to move through the site, but where other things move through the site too, and work around that and work with that. So the protection that you need for a garden may well be temporary protection just to get things happening, or it could be more permanent, like a bigger fence or a living fence of some sort. And once you've started thinking through all of this, that's the time to start getting into looking at all the different species lists and compiling all the different things that you want to put into it. So I wanted to just mention a little bit about swales. If you're on a slight slope or even quite a steep slope, you can create swales which help to really activate and speed up the process of getting a food forest started. As you can see, basically what it is it's a ditch followed by a mound. So the material you take out of that, you load up on the lower side, and that's where you plant. And so this swale, which is on contour, so it's not a drain, it doesn't drain it out, it just slows the water down so it infiltrates down into that spot. And what you see is both a plume of soil life and greater growth, both uphill and downhill. It's really interesting to actually watch that happening. So what you can do is create a series of these swales down your slope, and they can actually become a pathway. You can fill them in with mulch or wood chips and other materials so that you can walk along it, as well as it being a water infiltration. So in really high rains, it'll probably end up being more of a water pond ditch, but other times it's absolutely fine to walk along. So in that spot you can plant water-loving plants, and on the edges plant things like comfrey, which can be broad and act as a weed barrier to stop things coming into what would really be good to have as a fully mulched section with lots of ground covers acting as living mulch. So you have all those different layers of a food forest, but around this swale system underneath. So it's really important to think about not just the trees when you're considering a food forest, but how you're managing your landscape and what earthworks you need to do beforehand. Another way to do it could be terracing. So on a slope, this is similar to my sort of terracing setup. Up the top I have some chickens, and above that is my more broader food forest system. The chickens can go out into that and come back into this protected straw yard. They have some western shade from a tree that protects them from the harsh sun, and the materials from them go into the compost bays next to that, and the leaching and the materials from the compost goes into this upper terrace of the food forest, which is in the middle of the picture. So there's bananas and dwarf citrus and lots of ground covers and perennials. I'll show you a picture of that soon. And then there's a pathway. So actually the pathway that's part of that actually is a soak for water. It's like a swale at the top of the terrace. Then when you get to the terrace wall, the next pathway acts as a water soak as well. And this is more the kitchen garden food forest, which is right off from my main house. And then a flat area for playing. And then below that again is another more wilder food forest. So there's zones of food forests that you can have, some that have more open sun access, some that are really enclosed and quite multi-layered. And it depends, and you can vary that throughout your site. It's like creating openings in the forest to allow more light in, or really create a vibrantly complex natural, a cultivated system that's like a natural system. Now this is the bird's eye view of what I just showed you before, and why I wanted to show you this was because using pathways is a really important way of maximising the amount of space that you have for the garden, and also maximising the way that you can collect water that falls on your garden and sending it into the garden itself. So as you can see, there's a main contour path, and that's a really good pathway for wheelbarrows and delivering materials and heading across over to the worms, and then from that are lots of little keyhole pathways that the water flows into and then infiltrates into the garden. So they're like little soaks all the way along, and from each of those keyhole pathways I can reach into the middle of the garden, so I never have to step on the soil there. And the wall on the other side, as I walk along there, I can reach into the middle too. And a lot of the wall I'm trying to cover up with plants which dangle over the edge, whether it be self-seeding tomatoes or weeping rosemaries and Brazilian spinach dangling over the edge to try and soften the wall edge, but also stop the sun from heating it up so much and heating up the soil behind. Now, how do you get it all started though? If you've got an empty paddock with nothing on it, what do you do? Well, one way could be having a chicken tractor and sending the chickens out to start to manure the site and eat up some of the weeds and start to activate it in that way. But that would be for a small area. If you've got a larger area, one of the things that I did throughout my site when I first got it was to get a 3-tine ripper, similar to this, behind a lightweight tractor. And what it did, it basically went deep down into the soil and opened it up underneath. So you can see it's just like a slicing and an opening underneath. So it lets air and moisture in and helps to break up compaction that is on a site. So if you've got a compacted site and you're doing a more broader scale food forest system, you might want to consider doing that. And I also did that with a key line in mind too, meaning that I'm on a slope, and so what I did was I did it slightly off contour to bring the water that was rushing off the edges to get that back onto the ridge again. So that's probably going to the next step, and maybe another course I'll talk more about that. But so there's different options, from simple chicken tractors to using an actual tractor to just loading up your site with lots of organic matter. Some places in the city I've just been collecting all sorts of cuttings and clippings from neighbourhood gardens and grass clippings and just loading it up on site, getting lots of organic matter and letting the soil activate itself, because the soil was so hard there was no way that I could even dig it. And really the idea is not to dig it too much. In our garden, setting up our food forest system, what we did was start out by loading up our terraced area with a lot of the topsoil from our house pad that we cut. But before we did that, we actually had a bobcat driver come in and cut the terrace pathway. So we had nice level contour pathways that we could work with to start with. And you can see all the way around, there's lots of mustard spinaches coming up. Now I just let them go because rather than having a blank site, I wanted to have plants that were covering the soil. I wanted to have plants that were adding organic matter in, and they would just end up becoming part of the soil in the longer term. And you can see here the topsoil that's now been laid over the top. So that's all our stockpiled topsoil from our own garden that we got from our house cut. So if you are doing some kind of construction work, keep that topsoil for your vegetable garden, because it's much better than the topsoil that you'll import from somewhere else. If you do need to import topsoil, that's fine, but you'll need to activate it with some other local materials to really bring the local soil life into it. And then this picture on the right is what that garden looks like in just a period of maybe a year and a half, with getting lots of organic matter, lots of mulching, and planting it out with perennials as thickly as we could. So succession is a really important part of this process, because essentially nature is working towards complexity, and it's actually a more stable and resilient system. I mean, if you look what happens to any type of environment, any type of abandoned site or open, bare soiled site, very rapidly you get what we call weeds coming in to grow there. They're trying to colonize that site. And then there's sort of woody shrubs that start to come out, and then eventually the trees and climbers. And essentially that's what your food forest is. So the very site that you were looking at before, I'll just go back and show you this one. So that's before it got started, about a year or two in, and then this is 7 years later. So you can see it's a completely different system. There's now tree crops and canopy crops and a lot more perennials growing in a quite dense environment. And there's very few weeds that ever come through this site, because weeds get shaded out. I mean, essentially weeds grow to try and protect the soil, and they're the first ones that come up and opportunistic, here's some light, here's some space, and they'll grow. All soil has weed seeds in it. This would have the weed seeds in it too, but just not the environment that's good for it. So focus on succession, because that's what nature wants to do. It actually takes more energy to try and keep it in a simpler system than it does to allow it to grow into this multi-layered abundance. So you replicate nature. Start first with the fast-growing pioneer species, whether they be the fast-growing herbs or the fast-growing vegetables, and then the shrubs, and add the diversity over time. You're not going to get this straight away. So focus on adding diversity over time and adding in the perennials, and also self-seeding annuals. Allow things like the nasturtiums to self-seed their way through the garden. Allow the comfrey to come and go over the years, and also here I have taro at the bottom, which comes in the summertime and dies back in the winter. Same with the turmeric. So all of these plants ebb and flow over time, and it's a natural process, and it's really interesting to watch how over the seasons these things change. So again, just to show you the change that can happen in a short period of time, this particular photo on the left is the same as the one on the right, just taken a few years apart. So the one here has a lot of mints and flowers and herbs and things like tansies and basils and asparagus, all low growing things that just creating a mass. And it's quite messy and chaotic, but very quickly it transfers into something that it creates its own structure and finds its own space. And all you need to do is just to keep finding where there is maybe a possible space and adding in extra plants as you go. So start with the pioneers. Really, that's the first spot to start with. So whether it might be ground cover, pioneer legumes that will cover the soil, or perhaps they're the shrubs like the pigeon peas, which will help to get that cover that you want, and materials that you can chop and drop into the soil. It improves the soil, it helps to give the garden some structure, provides shade for some of the smaller species, lots of organic matter and mulch. It's food as well. You can eat the peas and the flowers, and it's fodder as well for the animals in your system. So some examples for this might be in the warm climate, the pigeon pea or acacias, or possibly even ice cream bean. In cooler climates, you might be looking at things like alders or lupins. And always try and encourage the volunteers within your food forest system, those annual plants in particular that just keep coming back year after year. And as long as your soil environment is fully mulched and rich and as it should be in a food forest, these things will keep coming. So that's your mustards and your pumpkins, tomatoes, lettuces, corianders, rockets, amaranth, flowers like marigold and nasturtium, and even chia can seed itself out through the garden. You might even find little pockets of purslane and chickweed, weeds actually, these things, but they're called weeds, but actually they're very useful, edible and medicinal plants, and will colonize parts of your garden that need protection. So if you find a blank spot somewhere, most often you'll find something like a purslane or a chickweed in a moist spot starting to take that and cover it. And nettles, of course, or even some creeping plants which will just keep coming back all the time. Tomatoes or passion fruits, chocos, they will sort of die back over the winter time and then sprout back and come back in full force in the summertime. And of course, lots and lots of perennials of all different sorts. Perennials that are helping to feed the soil and helping to provide organic matter, but also that are feeding you and your family. So comfrey arrowroot, which is the Queensland arrowroot, or Canna edulis, lots of different mints or oreganos, rosemaries around the drier edges. And so you can think about too, where your garden, in the middle of it, it's more shady and moist. So there'll be different sorts of plants that go better there as opposed to the ones on the drier edges. So you can look at that whole food forest as a system and interplant in ways that fit with the needs of the plants. Gingers and turmerics like it more moist, and lemongrass is very hardy. You can have that as an edge plant. Yacon will grow quite nicely in a more shaded environment. Sweet potato will ramble its way underneath through things, and taro likes a nice moist spot. Suriname spinach is one of the greens that I have throughout the summer in a subtropical garden, and it's sort of a low mound of beautiful soft leaves that will grow in a relatively shady spot like Brazilian spinach. And cranberry hibiscus is a perennial plant in my area, and it's that mid-layer shrub, and it can be harvested regularly. You can have it on a pathway and keep trimming it and taking the beautiful purple greens in for your meal. So lots of food, lots of support for the other plants, and a lot of organic matter can come from these perennials. And these are so hardy, these ones. These ones in the self-seeding vegetables are ones that can keep your system really thriving and alive, and they come and go. And sometimes you just, you might think, oh, my turmeric's dying back, or my, the cabbages or the kales are getting eaten by something. Well, it might be time for them to finish and for something else to take their place. And you work with those cycles, and don't try and force it. As long as there's enough diversity, that system will put something else in its place. So there's so much that you can grow in these types of environments. Massive amounts of turmerics, and this is chia on the right-hand side. You can eat both the leaves and the seeds of that. With society garlic, it's a great edge plant, so you can eat the leaves and the flowers of that. And with the turmeric, you can also use the leaves as a wrap, and they create a really great environment for collecting moisture and for frogs to live in and amongst that too. So it's diverse, it's beautiful, it's productive, and really it's about observing at the start to look at what it is that's possible, to setting up your ground well, and then starting simply with pioneers and hardy plants and getting the diversity as you go. So the really important thing too that I haven't mentioned so far is actually about where to plant your main species. Now that would be one of the first considerations that you have when you're laying things out. Make sure you give your plants, your main fruit trees, enough space in between them. I typically grow a lot of dwarf variety plants, particularly in smaller food forests, because it gives me more chance to have more diversity. So, I space them out 3 or 4 meters apart, which then gives me space to interplant with so many other different sorts of things. Prepare your holes well. Make sure you've made sure you've dug them nice and deeply, and added maybe some really rich compost or well-rotted manure into the base before you plant, and give them good soaking and watering before you plant into it. Allow that to seep in, then plant your tree, and from there you can start to interplant around it. So the earlier you get your trees in, your fruit trees in, I think is a good idea, because they often take longer. So you plant your trees in and then interplant all these other things around.